All right, welcome back to All Cars Y'all. It is time for another Motor Week retro review reaction. This week it is the 1993 Mazda 626. Now I am doing this one for me. I've done a couple of other Mazdas. I had a request for 929, also a Genesis. I want to get to those as well, but I wanted to talk about this generation 626 because I really like it, and I think it's a little underappreciated. So, as always, we're just a couple of friends sitting here chatting and reminiscing about the good old days of 25 years ago, or 30. So sit back in your comfy chair, grab your beverage of choice. Let's take a little trip down memory lane.
The Mazda 626 is a car that we at Motorweek are intimately familiar with, having had one in our long-term test fleet 3 years ago. That 626 served us well, consistently scoring high marks for its reliability, comfort, and performance. But stiff competition from sales powerhouses such as the Honda Accord and Toyota Camry threatened to push the 626 out of the family sedan market. So Mazda has reworked its mainstay sedan to meet the latest challenges. And we were anxious to drive the 1993 Mazda 626 to see if it now has what it takes to hold its ground in this tough market segment.
So before they get into it, here's my broad thoughts. I've always liked Mazda, and I've said on the channel before, I bought a Protege, that 2000-something Protege that I absolutely loved and I never should have gotten rid of, but I've always had a pretty high opinion of them. Every one I've ever been in, but they've never been super popular, not like Toyotas and Hondas and things like that. During the 80s, my broad brush, right, of Mazda histories, during the 80s, they built really good sedans. They were reliable, they were rode well, a little boringly styled, maybe more interesting than some of the Nissans like the Stanza and things like that. But they never really had that sales success compared to Honda and Toyota. They were good, they were just a little underappreciated. Then the 90s happened. And there's good and there's bad news here, but I did that Mazda MX-6, which I think took the MX-6 from a pretty boring wedge that was second to the Probe to something that I think is pretty darn gorgeous, as a matter of fact. And they kind of did this across the lineup, and that's why I wanted to do the 626. The 929 might be a little too bubulous, but it was a really pretty car and pretty impressive. They just missed the mark a little bit. Same thing with the 626. This is a really good-looking car that's just kind of decent everywhere, but I bring it all up because Honda's doing their thing, Toyota's doing their thing, and then Mazda, my opinion, right, styling is subjective, I think Mazda took a leap forward to being the most stylish of the automakers, of the Japanese automakers. They went from building pretty basic angle wedges to this. It's not a supercar, it's not a Ferrari, but wow, I thought it at least was the best looking in the class. But let's see what they say. That's why I brought this video up for us.
Our staff's first impression of the new Mazda 626 was overwhelmingly positive. Where the previous car was handsome, the new 626 is stunning, borrowing much from its larger 929 brother. Aerodynamic sheet metal that blends elements of both classic European and modern Japanese design sits atop a new longer, wider front drive platform. And with over 75% U.S. content, the Michigan-built Mazda is officially classified as a domestic product.
And, you know, there's some danger in making all your products look kind of similar, because this looks a little bit like the 323, the Protege, and it looks a little bit like the 929. You want a more premier offering to pull up everybody else, not create something to compete with the Honda Accord and be like, oh, that looks like a Protege in the front. I think this is a stunning car. I really do. I also want to mention, I did a whole history of the Mazda planned luxury division called Amati, and when that all collapsed, they brought out the Millennia. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the Millennia was my favorite car of the 90s. Yeah, I think that's pretty fair to say. This is pretty up there in my mind. I'm a Saturn guy, which of course all was in the 90s, but this, I like the front end. It's reserved. It's a little too rounded for me in the sides here, but I like the rear end. It's a little bubbly, but it's a little, the tail lights are nice and big. It looks Asian, but not, and reserved at the same time. I dig it. I completely dig this car, and if you don't, I understand why. If you've got a preference for something else, if you think that the Ford Taurus looks better, that's your okay. That's all on you. But anyway, I like how this car looks. That's what this all says.
Those American workers have done a fine job of assembling the 626, both inside and out. The interior is modern and airy. Many dimensions actually exceed those of competitors like the Ford Taurus, despite the fact that the Mazda is a much smaller car. The dash is also very 90s. It has plenty of swooping curves, but it's more straightforward than the 929.
That's interesting that in the 90s they said this is a very 90s dash. I guess they're trying to say that Mazda updated it into the 90s from more 80-ish designs and more rectilinear, but I think it's a fantastic looking dash. My remembrance of sitting in them is that the plastic all came across a little bit cheap, because there's a lot of it. But you look at the big piece they've got across the top. They've got this big piece here, an instrument binnacle that, maybe it could be arced a little more on the top, but it's reserved. And then that center piece that comes down the middle there, I hope they talk about the labeling here. Radio looks a little busy, but everything's just big and a little bit of a mix of materials and a little bit of mix of colors. And I say on this channel all the time, certainly about older Hondas, about having a light and airy, right? Light and tossable. That's one of the things that the Japanese manufacturers did so much better, I think, than, compared to like the Taurus. And this really almost represents that to me. Not the most beautiful interior in the world, but boy, highly functional, and I love it. That's what I'm trying to say, guys. I love it. I think this might be a good example of what an interior should look like in my mind.
Switches are large and well marked. We tested the top ES grade car, which offers optional leather on its comfortable supportive bucket seats. Its combination of comprehensive power seat controls and the standard tilt airbag equipped steering wheel allows for an excellent driving position. Serious drivers, however, will want a more complete gauge package, but these analog units are large and easy to read. Heat and ventilation controls are uncluttered, as are the stereo controls. The only interior piece that isn't up to par is this flimsy cup holder. While rear legroom is actually less than its predecessor, overall rear seat room is still quite generous for a car that is less than 185 inches long.
Before they get to the trunk there, one quick thing. That was kind of a joke of a cup holder. Cup holder technology had not advanced to where I guess Mazda understood that Americans needed to put their super big gulp up there to drive to work. The other thing is, once they did a little closer on the radio, the buttons look pretty big. 90s Chrysler does it better. The one thing about the interior I really didn't like was that gear shift, that lever right there. It was not uncommon, but I have, in an effort to be fair, I have said things before about why was the gear shifter that long? It looks cheap to me. I think that it might have something to do with an armrest and where your hand rests on the actual gear lever itself. That's the argument I've heard, for example, from old Chevys. But I don't like it. It looks cheap and it looks chintzy to me, but probably pretty competitive for the era.
Pop the trunk lid and it rises clear. This and a low liftover allow easy loading of the 13.8 cubic foot trunk. The split folding rear seat back takes care of long cargo. Power for the ES is provided by Mazda's latest V6 engine. This 2.5-liter unit offers dual overhead cams, 24 valves, and 164 horsepower, 19 more than the old Turbo 4. DX and LX models get a new 2-liter 4-cylinder.
You know, my memory of that engine is, it's fine. It's not overwhelmingly exciting to drive. I don't remember it being, you know, something where you got into the accelerator and were like, wow. It just was competent at what it did. The 4-cylinder, it would have been what I chose, honestly, just for a little bit better gas mileage. But, you know, the 6 did not make this into a sports sedan.
Both engines feed power to the front wheels through a 5-speed manual gearbox, or our test car's slick new 4-speed automatic. The V6's extra horses come in handy since the new 626 is almost 200 pounds heavier. It reaches 60 in 8.3 seconds and covered the quarter mile in 16.4 seconds at 88 miles per hour. That's not as quick as our turbocharged 1988 test car, but that car's drivetrain can't match the new one's refinement. It's all smooth power delivery and effortless shifts, most impressive. The 626 uses the same chassis and suspension as the MX-6 and Ford Probe, so we understand why the new 626 has a more balanced feel than its predecessor. Its handling character is now more like a BMW than a mid-priced Japanese sedan. Lift the throttle in a hard turn and the rear will come around, but not without lots of warning. And then there are its highway manners.
Oh, no braking. That's a surprise. You know, all of that, going back to the trunk, 13 some odd cubic feet, not huge, you know, probably competitive, but it was an unbelievably useful shape. You know, not a lot of cutouts and cubbies and wheel arches and things in the way, just really, really useful shape. And that's my overwhelming impression here is this is just a really solid, good family car that's, let's say, more competent under the skin, but never really strives to be more than a family hauler. You know, and look at the acceleration numbers, the quarter mile. They said that it feels more like a BMW than a Japanese sedan. Really, really good praise for the car. It's not overly fast. It's not overly sporty, but if they're pushing it, it feels better. This car is competent. That's the word. And it's got a little more under the skin, it feels like, than Mazda's letting come through. They're not trying to build a sports sedan. They're not trying to build a Maxima competitor. They just built a really good car. Let's see how they finish it.
Which feature a tight but comfortable ride and fine fuel economy. The EPA expects our ES to get 19 city, 25 highway. Expect 23 in everyday driving. Our ES stopped with 4-wheel disc and optional ABS, which brought it down from 60 in an average distance of 120 feet. There was plenty of nosedive, but side-to-side stability was excellent. 626 prices start at $14,255 for the base 4-cylinder DX model. It's then up to $16,440 for the LX, also with a 4-banger. The V6 ES starts at $18,725, with our test car running $21,225. Too bad it's so pricey. Since the Mazda 626 ES has a lot going for it. There's the elegant styling, efficient interior, refined performance, and healthy list of standard features. Misses are 3. There's the sparse gauge package and flimsy cup holder, and how much it goes for. Still, the 1993 Mazda 626 is superior to its predecessor in every meaningful way. In a family sedan world full of Camrys, Tauruses, and Accords, it's a delightful and welcome change.
So I think this period in Mazda's history is largely overlooked. They had an amazing transformation in the 90s. And part of that is the money they had and the development they were putting in for that Amati project that, again, became the Millennia. And they ended up with the 929 and the Millennia, both at the top of the lineup. But it trickled down. And it's good and it's bad. I really, from my younger years, this would have been in my 20s, this is one of the more memorable cars for me. I like this Mazda way more than I liked a Honda Accord generally speaking. But it represents a transformation of Mazda, going from those more boring but very competently engineered to something a little more interesting, a little more not exciting, a little more beautiful, right? And unfortunately, they kind of lost their focus. I think the engineering was still solid. I don't know if this generation, I think it did, but I don't know for sure if this generation still had the vents that went back and forth. Cool little feature that always got people talking. My stepfather, at some point in the 90s, was looking at cars, and he'd driven a Mazda, and he's like, man, the vents went back and forth. First off, that's really cool, but he's also an engineer as well, and, in his training and in his college, and the first thing he thought of is, well, there's little motors somewhere that are going to break. So he ended up not getting one, which I still regret, but they were at least in the conversation, and they were building interesting cars, and I think this is a supremely good-looking car. I think the 929 is good-looking. I think the Protege was good-looking. So I don't think Mazda is appreciated for the transformation they had between the 80s and the 90s. But they did kind of lose their focus, so to speak, because this is not upscale, and it's not sporty. It's just pretty darn good looking in that mid-size space. And the problem Mazda ran into, which they've tried to rectify in probably the past 15 years, is they tried to out-Camry the Camry. And they did this up and down their lineup in most ways. And it's the same problem that Subaru got into. In the quest for more sales, they lost a focus or a unique selling position. So they ended up with a car that's pretty good looking, but not gorgeous. It doesn't really look upscale. It kind of does. It looks great to my eyes. It's got everything is nice and solid, but if you're looking for something that's pretty good looking and pretty solid and pretty good power and Japanese reliability, why would you buy this over a Toyota or a Honda? And that's kind of where Mazda ended up falling, and I feel like they kind of wandered in the woods a little bit, not being elegant, not being sporty, not being, like Subaru ended up going back to their roots and saying we have all-wheel drive and we love dogs. So I hope you see what I'm saying there. This was a revolution for them, a transformational phase across their lineup, but it pitted them toe-to-toe with the people, the brands that they could never really beat. Now, Mazda eventually said, wait a minute, we've got to jump back. Let's impart personality to our cars. Zoom, zoom. And now their cars, their SUVs, are better looking, much better interiors typically than their competitors. A little bit of zoom zoom in there. They're still not quite hitting it. I don't like that they're moving upscale. Why would I choose a Mazda if there's Genesis and BMW and everything else? So I think this represents a transformational period for them, but also they kind of made the mistake of going toe-to-toe with the big boys, and it left them largely without an identity other than like the RX series or the Miata. I love the car. I absolutely love the car. Would love to drive one and review it again, because ultimately I think it's probably just really vanilla, but that's what you want, unless you're looking for that sports sedan. I just want a good looking car that's comfortable, that's reliable, and that I come out to and I'm like, that's mine. And that's what this car does for me. Let me know your thoughts below, guys. Appreciate you being here.